Welcome to my YouTube channel at Sci-Fi Tales Pules. Please subscribe, like, and share to support my channel. The royal city of New Avalon was calm under the silver glow of the night. The palace stood high above the city, like a guardian made of stone and gold. Inside its tall walls and shining halls lived Queen Isabella, a woman respected by her people for her wisdom and kindness. She ruled with a steady hand, making sure peace was kept across the land. Her greatest joy, however, was her baby son, Adrian. He was only 6 months old, and his smile could melt even the coldest heart. That night, the queen had finished her duties earlier than usual. She went to the nursery where her son was resting. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers, and the gentle light of the moon came through the tall windows. Adrian was sleeping in his crib, wrapped in a soft white blanket embroidered with the royal crest. She touched his cheek and smiled, feeling a wave of love and pride. After a short time, the queen's laddie-in-waiting reminded her that she still had documents to review before morning. The queen kissed her son's forehead, whispered a promise to return, and left the nursery with a soft sigh. The door closed quietly behind her. Hours passed. The palace was silent, except for the distant footsteps of guards. But in the nursery, shadows moved where they should not. The window had been left slightly open to let in fresh air. A hand reached in, and soon a tall figure slipped into the room. Moving with skill and speed, the stranger lifted the baby from his crib. Adrian stirred but did not cry. The blanket wrapped around him muffled the sound of his small breaths. The figure disappeared through the window into the night, leaving only the empty crib behind. The next morning, Queen Isabella awoke to the sound of raised voices outside her chamber. She opened the door to find her chief guard pale and shaken. His voice trembled as he told her the terrible news. The nursery was empty. Prince Adrian was gone. The queen felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She ran to the nursery, her long gown sweeping across the polished floors. She saw the open window and the crib without her child. The blanket she had wrapped him in lay on the floor, cold and still. She picked it up with shaking hands, holding it to her chest, as though it could bring him back. The guards spread out through the palace and beyond, searching every hall, every gate, every street. Messengers rode out to the city walls to alert the watchmen. The people of New Avalon soon learned that their prince was missing. Some wept openly. Others whispered in fear about what this could mean for the kingdom. That night, the queen stood alone on her balcony, looking out over the city. The lanterns below flickered like fireflies. She thought of her son's tiny hands, his warm smile, the way his eyes seemed to follow her every move. The thought of him in the hands of strangers filled her with dread. In another part of the city, far from the palace, Ethan Cole walked down a dim street. He had no idea the kingdom was holding its breath. A former soldier, Ethan was no stranger to danger. But tonight he only wanted to buy food and return to his small apartment above a repair shop. His life was quiet now, far from the days when he wore armor and carried a rifle for the kingdom. The wind blew harder as he turned into a narrow alley to take a shortcut. In the shadows, he noticed a small shape near a pile of crates. At first, he thought it was a bundle of cloth someone had thrown away. But then it moved. He stepped closer and saw the tiny face of a baby peeking out from a blanket with a crest stitched in gold thread. The child's eyes opened, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. Ethan crouched down and lifted the bundle carefully. The baby was warm but tired, his breathing soft and slow. Ethan looked around, but the alley was empty. Whoever had left the child was long gone. Somewhere in the city, Queen Isabella was praying for her son's safety. She did not yet know that a stranger had found him, and Ethan did not yet know that the child in his arms was the future king of the land. Ethan held the baby close to his chest, looking around the dark alley. The city was quiet except for the distant sound of horses and carts on the main road. He had found many strange things in his life as a soldier, but this was the first time he had found a baby in such a place. The gold-stitched crest on the blanket caught his eye. He had seen it before, years ago, during his service near the royal palace. It belonged to the royal family. He felt a sudden unease. If the royal child was here, alone in an alley, something terrible must have happened. He thought about taking the baby straight to the palace gates, but his instincts warned him not to. If someone had gone to such trouble to steal the child, then taking him back without knowing who could be trusted might put the boy in even greater danger. The baby stirred in his arms and made a small sound. Ethan rocked him gently and whispered, telling him it was going to be all right. He pulled the blanket tighter to keep the child warm and left the alley. He took the longer route home, avoiding the busy streets and well-lit squares. When he reached his small apartment above the repair shop, he closed the door behind him and set the baby on his narrow bed. The room was plain and tidy, yet only a wooden chair, a small table, and a shelf of old books. The baby looked around with wide eyes as if trying to understand this strange new place. Ethan heated some water and made a warm drink from powdered milk he had kept in his cupboard. He fed the baby slowly, holding him carefully so he would not choke. The child's tiny fingers gripped his shirt. For a moment, Ethan felt a strange warmth in his chest, something he had not felt in years. As the baby fell asleep, Ethan sat down at the table and thought. He knew he could not keep the child hidden for long. The royal guard would soon search every corner of the city, and if the same people who took the prince were still looking for him, they would not stop until they found him again. He decided he needed help, but not from the palace. There was only one person he could trust, Claire Morgan, a medic, who had served beside him during the eastern border conflict. Claire was clever, resourceful, and had saved his life more than once. She had left the army before he did, and now worked quietly as a healer in the poorer districts. The next morning, Ethan wrapped the baby in a thicker blanket and carried him through the back streets toward Clara's small clinic. The morning sun was pale, and the city was already full of noise. Market stalls opened, merchants called out prices. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the scent of smoke from cooking fires. When he reached the clinic, Claire was tending to an old man's injured leg. She looked up, surprised to see Ethan. Her eyes moved to the baby in his arms, and she froze. "Where did you get him?" she asked in a low voice, glancing toward the door. Ethan told her everything, speaking quickly but clearly. He described finding the baby, the royal crest on the blanket, and his fear that someone inside the palace might be involved. Claire listened without interrupting, her face pale. When he finished, she took a deep breath. "If you're right, Ethan, this is dangerous for both of us. But if you're telling the truth, this boy is in more danger than you know." She locked the clinic door and led him into the back room. They laid the baby on a small bed, and Claire examined him carefully. She said he was healthy, only a little cold and hungry. She smiled faintly as she wrapped him again. Ethan felt a small wave of relief, but it did not last long. Through the thin walls of the clinic, he heard the sound of heavy boots outside. Men's voices called out to each other, and the noise of armor rattled with every step. Claire looked at him sharply. "The royal guard," she whispered. Ethan moved toward the back door, motioning for Claire to follow with the baby. They slipped out into the narrow lane behind the clinic. Just as the guards began knocking on the front. He did not know where they were going yet, but he knew one thing for certain. They had to keep moving if they wanted to keep the child safe. The lane behind Claire's clinic was narrow and dark, lined with old brick walls and piles of wooden crates. Ethan moved quickly, keeping his head low. Claire followed close behind, holding the baby against her chest. The morning air was cool, and the faint sound of the guards' voices carried from the front of the building. They turned down a side path that led deeper into the poorer part of the city. Here the streets were uneven, and the smell of smoke and damp earth hung in the air. People glanced at them briefly, but did not ask questions. In this part of New Avalon, most people knew better than to get involved in someone else's troubles. Ethan stopped under the shadow of an old archway to think. Claire's eyes met his, full of worry. "We can't keep running all day," she whispered. "They'll search every street before nightfall." He nodded. "Then we need somewhere they won't think to look, at least for a while." Claire thought for a moment. "I know a place. There's an old storehouse near the river. My uncle used to keep supplies there, but it's been empty for years. It's quiet, and no one goes there anymore." They kept moving, staying off the main roads. Baby slept through most of it, his head resting against Claire's shoulder. Every so often, she would glance down to make sure he was still warm. The river was on the far side of the city. It took them more than an hour to reach it, weaving through back alleys and side streets. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached, mixing with the cries of gulls circling overhead. The storehouse stood at the end of a narrow pier. Its walls were made of weathered wood, and the windows were dusty and dark. Ethan pushed the heavy door open. the hinges creaking softly. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of old grain. Sunlight slipped through cracks in the boards, painting thin lines across the floor. Claire laid the baby on a folded blanket in the corner, while Ethan checked the building. There was only one entrance, but a trapdoor at the back led down to a small storage area beneath the floor. If needed, it could hide them from anyone who came in. Ethan sat down beside the baby. "We can rest here for a while," he said quietly. "But we still need to figure out who took him and why." Claire sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking about that. If this was just a ransom, they would have made demands by now. But it's been a day and nothing. It means it's about something else, something bigger." Ethan's mind went back to the palace. He remembered the way the royal guard operated, the way certain nobles whispered behind closed doors. "It could be someone inside the court," he said slowly. "Someone who wants power." Claire's eyes narrowed. That's true. Taking him back to the palace could put him right back in their hands. A sound outside made them both freeze. It's a slow crunch of boots on the wooden pier. Ethan moved silently to the door and peered through a crack. Two men in dark coats stood there, talking quietly. They were not wearing the armor of the royal guard, but there was something in the way they scanned the area that made Ethan uneasy. One of the men stepped closer to the storehouse door. Ethan stepped back, his hand reaching for the small knife he kept hidden in his belt. But then the men turned and walked away down the pier. Claire let out a breath. "Out. They're looking for us," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "And they'll keep looking until they find him." The baby stirred and let out a small cry. Claire quickly picked him up and rocked him gently, murmuring soft words until he quieted again. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ethan knew they could not stay in the storehouse forever. The people hunting them were too determined. They needed to move again, but this time with a plan. Somewhere in the city was the truth about who had taken the prince and why, and Ethan was determined to find it, no matter the cost. The air inside the storehouse grew colder as the evening shadows deepened. Ethan sat by the door, listening to the faint creak of the wooden walls and the distant rush of the river. Every sound outside made him tense. Claire sat beside the baby, keeping him wrapped tightly in the blanket. The child slept peacefully, unaware of the danger that surrounded them. Ethan knew they could not hide forever. Whoever was searching for the prince had resources, men, and money. It would only be a matter of time before they found the storehouse. They needed to get ahead of their enemies, not just run from them. Claire spoke softly. "If we want answers, we need to start looking in the right places. I've heard rumors about a man named Lord Halcroft. He's been meeting secretly with other nobles. Some say he's been trying to gather enough power to control the court." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He had seen Lord Halcroft before at public ceremonies. The man had a sharp face and a cold smile. "If he's behind this," Ethan said, "then the baby was taken for a reason. And it's not just for money." Claire nodded. "We need proof before we can do anything. And there's only one place where proof like that would be kept inside the palace itself." The thought of going back to the palace was dangerous. The guards there would be on high alert, and if any of them were loyal to Halcroft, Ethan would be walking straight into a trap. But it was the only way to learn the truth. They agreed to move at night when the streets would be quieter. Until then, they rested as best they could. Ethan sharpened his knife and checked the small pouch of coins he had left. Claire fed the baby again, whispering to him while he looked up at her with trusting eyes. When darkness finally fell, they left the storehouse. The city was lit by lanterns, their light flickering on the cobblestones. They kept to the shadows, moving through narrow lanes until they reached the palace walls. From there, they could see the guards walking their usual routes. Ethan had once been part of the royal guard, so he knew the timing of the patrols. He waited for the moment when two guards passed each other and left a small gap in their watch. Then he led Claire through a narrow servant's gate at the side of the palace. It was unlocked, just as he remembered. Inside, the palace felt different than before. The halls were quiet, but there was a heaviness in the air, as if secrets lingered in every shadow. They kept to the servants' corridors, avoiding the main hallways. Ethan led the way toward the west wing where the royal council chambers were located. They reached a locked door with a brass handle. Ethan took a small metal tool from his pocket and worked it into the lock until it clicked open. Inside, the room smelled of paper and ink. Shelves lined the walls, filled with scrolls and records. Claire set the baby down gently on a pile of folded cloth and began searching the shelves. Ethan opened a heavy wooden box on the desk. Inside, he found sealed letters, each marked with Lord Halcroft's crest. As he read through them, his jaw tightened. The letters spoke of plans to control the Queen through fear, to create a crisis so large she would have no choice but to accept his demands. The kidnapping of the prince was part of that plan. Before they could take the letters, a sound outside the door made them both freeze. Heavy boots stopped right outside the room. A key turned in the lock. Ethan moved quickly, shoving the letters into his coat and grabbing the baby. Claire ran to the far side of the room, searching for another way out. A narrow window stood open, letting in the cool night air. Without hesitation, Ethan climbed through, lowering the baby into Claire's waiting arms before jumping down himself. They landed in a small courtyard and ran toward the outer wall. Shouts rang out behind them as guards gave chase. The lantern light danced across the walls, and the sound of boots grew louder. Ethan and Claire reached a section of the wall where an old ladder leaned against the stones. They climbed quickly, the baby cradled against Claire's chest. As they dropped down to the other side, Ethan knew their lives had just become even more dangerous. They had proof now, but Halcroft would stop at nothing to silence them. The streets were empty as Ethan and Claire moved quickly through the city, keeping to the shadows. The baby was wrapped tightly against Claire's chest, his small face hidden beneath the blanket. Ethan's coat rustled as he held the stolen letters close. The proof of Lord Halcroft's plot was now in their hands, but they knew it would not be enough just to have it. They had to get it to the Queen herself. The sky was turning pale with the first light of morning when they reached the outer courtyard of the palace. The high walls rose above them, guarded by men with spears and polished armor. Ethan knew that walking through the main gates would mean being stopped, searched, and likely arrested. They needed another way in. He remembered an old entrance used by the gardeners, hidden behind a row of tall hedges. Years ago it had been almost forgotten, but Ethan prayed it was still there.
They circled the palace grounds
Until they reached the hedge wall, the dew on the leaves soaking their clothes. Behind the greenery, half covered in vines, was the small wooden door. Ethan pushed against it. The hinges groaned, but the door gave way, opening into a narrow path that led toward the inner gardens. They moved quickly, keeping low to avoid being seen by the guards on the wall. From there it was only a short walk to the royal quarters. The sun had risen enough to cast a golden light over the palace, and the smell of morning flowers filled the air. Claire held the baby close as they approached the Queen's private balcony from a side path. 2 guards blocked the way. Their hands moved to their swords as they saw Ethan and Claire step forward. Ethan raised his voice, firm but calm. "I must speak to the Queen. I have her son." The guards froze for a moment, unsure if they had heard correctly. Claire pulled the blanket back just enough to reveal the baby's face. The prince stirred and let out a soft sound. The guards' eyes widened, and one of them ran to alert the Queen. Moments later, Queen Isabella appeared, her long gown trailing behind her as she stepped out onto the balcony. Her eyes locked on the bundle in Claire's arms. Without waiting for permission, she hurried down the steps toward them. Claire handed the baby to her. The Queen's hands trembled as she held him close, her face breaking into tears. She kissed his head again and again, whispering his name. The boy reached up with tiny fingers, touching her cheek. Ethan stood silently, watching the reunion. For a moment, all the danger, the running, and the fear seemed far away. The Queen turned to Ethan, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You brought him back to me," she said softly. Ethan stepped forward and handed her the letters. "These are from Lord Halcroft. They prove he was behind the kidnapping." The Queen's expression hardened as she took the papers. "Find him now." The guards bowed and left at once, their armor clinking as they hurried away. The Queen looked back at Ethan. "You have risked your life for my son, and for this kingdom will not be forgotten." Ethan shook his head. "I didn't do it for reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do." The Queen smiled faintly. "And that is why you are the kind of man this kingdom needs." She turned to one of her attendants. "Prepare a place for him in my council. His honor is restored." Claire stood beside Ethan, her eyes soft with pride. "Looks like your quiet life is over," she said with a small smile. Ethan gave a short laugh. "Seems that way." The palace bells began to ring, their sound echoing across the city. News of the prince's return spread quickly. People gathered outside the palace gates, cheering as they learned their future king was safe. Ethan stood on the balcony beside the queen as she stepped forward to show her people that the boy had been found. The morning sun lit the scene, casting the palace in a warm glow. The baby laughed, his tiny hands waving in the air. For the first time in many years, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. He had not only saved a child, but also protected the future of a kingdom. And though he did not know what the days ahead would bring, he knew he would face them with the same courage that had carried him this far. Thank you for watching and being part of our community.